the family oven where everything begins. Mexico City, the 1920s. The city is still trying to settle after the revolutionary turbulence. With its avenues growing in irregular ways, its markets being reborn among dusty streets, and that air of opportunity that appears when a country begins to stabilize. In a neighborhood of constant activity, when daylight has not yet fully appeared and most houses remain closed, a modest bakery called El Molino is already working at full speed. The oven, which always seems to wake before any person, roars with a heat that pushes away the cold of dawn. The trays collide with each other with a metallic sound that resonates in the narrow interior. The sacks of flour slide as if they had a life of their own, and the smell of bread being born mixes with the aroma of burned wood. In the middle of all that movement, a child stays near the counter, attentive to every gesture of his family, trying to understand why this trade demands so many early mornings and so few pauses. Before continuing, I am very curious to know from which place in the world and at what time you are joining tonight. I would love to read you in the comments. In that bakery, which more than a business was an extension of the home and a continuation of family life, the entrepreneurial sensitivity was formed that would later define one of the largest bread-making companies on the planet. The Cerviche family, a family of Catalan immigrants who arrived in Mexico seeking stability, found in bread something more than a way to earn their livelihood. Day after day, they repeated routines that seemed simple but demanded absolute precision. Measuring the humidity of the dough without instruments, knowing the temperature of the oven without thermometers, and adjusting recipes with an intuition that can only be reached after years of observing and failing. Into that environment, Lorenzo, still very young, entered with a mix of respect and curiosity, aware that each piece of bread represented not only the quality of the product, but the reputation of his family. The bakery operated under an unbreakable principle. The customer had to receive the best bread possible, no matter the additional effort that implied. For the family, that idea was not an inspiring phrase hanging on the wall, but a daily obligation. If the bread came out pale, the batch had to be repeated. If the kneading had not been uniform, they started again. If the customer had a complaint, it was resolved without discussion. That environment, so demanding for some, was simply normality for those who lived among ovens and counters. And for a child who grew up surrounded by that example, quality stopped being a theoretical concept and became a value rooted in the skin. In those years, the country was beginning to transform. The city expanded, businesses gained dynamism, and new needs emerged in households that aspired to greater comfort. However, the bakery trade remained anchored to traditional practices, where bread depended on the personal touch of the master of the oven and where unpredictability was part of the process. The Cerviche family, facing the same challenges day after day, began to develop a different way of understanding the business. Improvement was necessary, organization was necessary, and a more ordered way of producing had to be found to ensure consistent results. Although no grand idea yet existed, the seed of a broader vision was already forming. Lorenzo, growing within that environment, absorbed not only the trade but also the discipline and endurance it required. He watched closely how his parents managed the inventory with the rigor of those who know that a mistake can cost the livelihood of the next day. He saw how they treated customers with a mix of closeness and firmness, and how they valued punctuality almost as a sacred law. That way of managing a small but demanding business would become a fundamental part of his character when, years later, he would face decisions that would mark the business history of Mexico. Although life inside the bakery had an exhausting rhythm, it was also full of small moments that shaped the way the family understood work. The low-voiced conversations while waiting for the bread to ferment, the discussions about prices at the end of the day, the counting of coins that seemed like a silent ritual after closing, and the sense of accomplishment when customers returned saying they could not find bread like that anywhere else. Each of those elements built the idea that a business only prospers if there is absolute dedication to quality and service. Little by little, the city began to change. Demand increased. New opportunities appeared, and the family had to adapt. El Molino, without ceasing to be a small business, became a practical school of administration, production, and customer service. There they taught how to work with the mind and with the hands, how to make quick decisions, and how to understand that each choice could have a considerable impact. For a young person who learned almost everything by observing, it was like attending a silent university, where lessons were not given in classrooms but in front of burning ovens. All these experiences shaped Lorenzo's vision, who was beginning to sense that bread could be more than a local trade. The insistence on hygiene, the standardization of processes, the concern for presentation, and the consistency and flavor already formed a way of thinking ahead of its time. El Molino was not only the economic base of the family, it was the laboratory where a philosophy was taking shape that, without knowing it yet, would become the backbone of a monumental company. However, this first chapter does not intend to glorify the origin, but to portray the reality of that early stage. Hard work, limited resources, constant learning, and a life built around an oven that must never fail. In that environment, full of silent commitments and demanding routines, the mindset was formed that years later would allow the imagination of something more ambitious. For now, everything happens in that narrow space where flour seems to float as if it were part of the air, where each day repeats itself with a mix of fatigue and hope, and where an immigrant family unknowingly plants the seed of a legacy. With this environment already established, the story moves toward a decisive moment, when the experience gained in that bakery transforms into a project that would change the bread industry in Mexico. Bimbo is born in a weary Mexico. The year is 1945. The streets of Mexico City live in a peculiar contrast. On one hand, there is a sense of worldwide relief after the end of the Second World War, while on the other, many Mexican families still deal with scarcity, economic instability, and the need to reinvent themselves to get through each day. Shops continue to open with effort, prices rise and fall depending on the availability of imported ingredients, and the population, already looking toward a more modern future, begins to desire products that are more practical, more reliable, and more consistent in quality. In the middle of this uncertain landscape, a group of young entrepreneurs, Lorenzo Cerviche, Jaime Jorba, Jaime Sendra, Jose T. Mata, Alfonso Velasco, and Roberto Cerviche, begins to meet with an idea that slowly stops being a conversation among acquaintances and becomes a project that keeps them awake at night. The need to organize a more efficient bread-making process arises from several simultaneous observations. The bread industry in Mexico is still artisanal, dependent on daily variability, with an offer that changes depending on the weather, on the master baker, and on the whims of the oven. The city is growing, consumers are changing, and the possibility of producing a standardized bread, more nutritious and constantly available in stores of all kinds, begins to appear as a huge opportunity. In those meetings, still informal, they discussed the creation of a loaf bread with uniform quality, well packaged, with an adequate shelf life, and with a flavor that could be replicated every day. This was not about producing another bread, but about creating a new standard in a category that, until that moment, remained trapped between traditional methods that no longer satisfied the demands of a country that was beginning to industrialize. Before the idea could consolidate, each of the partners contributed something different, from technical knowledge to ways of organizing production, along with financial analyses that allowed them to imagine the project with a certain realism. The vision was taking shape as the country transformed, and understanding the context is essential. The Second World War had affected international trade. Certain supplies were scarce, and others, like wheat, tended to arrive with variations in their quality. For many merchants, this represented a threat. For this small group of dreamers, it was a sign that there was room for a new model of bread making, a model that would take the best of the traditional method, but incorporate discipline, clear processes, and quality control to prevent the bread from depending solely on the intuition of an expert. When they finally decide to take the step, they do so boldly. On the 2nd of December of 1945, Panificación Bimbo is formally born. What begins with barely a few dozen employees and a handful of products, mainly loaf bread in different presentations, carries an atmosphere that mixes nervousness and enthusiasm. New ovens were needed, precise machinery, an adequate building, and, above all, impeccable coordination among those who carried the dream on their shoulders. Opening the doors of that first plant meant facing the real possibility of failure if consumers did not accept a product different from the one they had been buying for generations. The first day of production remained recorded as an episode full of tension. The machines, newly acquired and adapted, had to function with precision. The workers, many of them without experience in such an organized system, had to quickly adapt to strict routines. The bread had to come out impeccable to justify all the effort and investment. For Lorenzo, who had grown up among traditional ovens, seeing a more modern production line generated a mixture of fascination and responsibility. The new bread had to be soft, uniform, resistant, and, above all, fresh, because that would be the point that distinguished their offer from that of any common bakery. One of the great initial challenges was convincing merchants to accept a product more expensive than what they were used to buying. The bread wrapped in cellophane generated curiosity, but also a certain distrust. It seemed too modern for a market accustomed to loose pieces covered only by a cloth or simple paper. The shiny cellophane, which allowed the perfect slices to be seen, became the first symbol of modernity within a category that still did not fully understand the value of presentation. The founding team had to explain again and again that this packaging was not a luxury, but a way to ensure that the bread reached the home in the best possible condition. The commitment to quality brought long workdays. The first weeks were marked by constant adjustments, temperatures that did not match what was expected, doughs that needed small changes, and a baking process that demanded absolute precision. In the midst of these adjustments, the company maintained a strict discipline. The idea of failing was not something openly discussed, but it could be felt in the air during each test, each discarded batch, each attempt to improve the flavor or texture. Despite the pressure, there was a shared feeling that they were participating in something different, in a company that aspired to break with the routine of traditional bread making. While the city continued its chaotic rhythm, inside the plant the atmosphere was almost introspective. They worked with a respectful silence when the bread entered the oven, as if everyone understood that this moment defined the future of the company. The satisfaction of seeing the first slices coming out uniform and soft was not only a technical achievement, it represented confirmation that the dream had substance. As the bread began to be distributed in selected stores, the founders analyzed each consumer reaction, each comment from the shopkeeper, and each detail of the process to adjust whatever was necessary. The birth of Bimbo coincided with a Mexico that sought modernity without losing its traditions. This balance was reflected in the new bread, an industrial product, but with the soul of a family bakery. The company began to be recognized for its cleanliness, its discipline, and its commitment to consistency, concepts that would soon become part of its identity. What started as a small project to improve the bread offer ended up being a movement that transformed the way the country understood bread making. And so, while the business took its first steps, and the country reorganized itself after a war that, although not fought on national territory, did affect its economy, the founders of Bimbo began to face a greater challenge, building a distinctive identity that could sustain the project over time, something that went far beyond the bread itself and that would require a carefully planned strategy. A strange name and a tender little bear. At the end of 1945, when the newly founded small company was still moving cautiously between days of enthusiasm and nights of worry, a need arose that seemed much more complex than anyone imagined. Giving the brand a name, the plant was already operating. The bread was beginning to be distributed in some stores. The machinery was slowly being adjusted, and the partners were starting to understand the magnitude of the project they had initiated. However, something essential was missing to connect with the public, an element that encapsulated the identity of this different, modern, and meticulously crafted bread. They needed to find a name that could be transmitted easily, one that expressed closeness and that would stay in the memory of consumers in a market where bread was still tied to the artisanal and the everyday. The initial proposals emerged in long meetings, among notebooks full of crossed-out ideas and lively conversations that sought to capture the essence of the project without falling into pretension. There were names that evoked tradition, others that highlighted modernity, and some that tried to combine both concepts without much success. In that search, a strange, brief word with a particular sound appeared: Bimbo. The term emerged almost like a phonetic game that drew attention because of its softness and that childlike charm that seemed to slide out each time it was pronounced. It did not have a concrete meaning for them at the time, but it was curious, different, easy to remember, and had a musicality that made it stand out in a list full of more solemn alternatives. The choice was not immediate. There were natural doubts about whether the word would be well received, whether it would cause confusion, or whether it would be taken seriously within a market that was not accustomed to such light and rounded names. However, the more it was repeated, the more sense it made. It was as if the brand had found a sound that reflected its intention of approaching the public in a friendly, accessible, and uncomplicated manner. In time, they would discover that in Italian the term was related to the word child, that in Chinese there was a similar pronunciation linked to bread, and that the combination of consonants and vowels made it a practically universal name. At that moment, even without knowing all those linguistic nuances, the founders felt that they had found something special. Alongside the name, the need arose to create a symbol to accompany this new identity. In a market where brands did not usually have characters, where advertising was still limited, and where products were distinguished more by their physical appearance than by graphic elements, the idea of having an emblem was innovative. However, for a company seeking to convey trust, cleanliness, and warmth, creating a character seemed like an ideal opportunity to reinforce those values. Thus, the Bimbo bear was born, a simple but tender drawing with a baker's hat, a spotless apron, and a kind expression that seemed to invite consumers to trust the product it represented. The figure of the little bear appeared for the first time in 1945, almost at the same time the company began its commercial life. Its design evoked purity and care, two characteristics highly valued at a time when consumers were becoming increasingly interested in hygiene and presentation. The character immediately solved an emotional need, making customers feel that they were purchasing bread prepared with attention, affection, and standards that surpassed the ordinary. The little bear was not just a decoration, it became an emotional bridge between the company and consumers, a silent companion that traveled in every package. The impact of the Bimbo bear was soon noticeable. Its presence on the packaging generated sympathy even among those who had never seen anything similar in baked products. The transparent cellophane allowed the perfection of the slices to be seen, and the character reinforced the idea of cleanliness and modernity. In a market where most bread was sold wrapped in craft paper or simple napkins, that package with a smiling bear was a statement of intent. It was the promise that this bread had been made under strict conditions and that its quality could be verified just by looking at it. The founders quickly understood that the brand was beginning to create its own language. The name, with its friendly sound, and the little bear, with its welcoming presence, transformed the product into something more than an everyday food. Each package had personality, history, and a clear message. We take care of what we do. This combination began to strengthen an emotional bond that, over time, would be decisive for the growth of the company. In a country where trust was a key factor when choosing food products, the brand had managed, from the beginning, to offer a sense of safety through its image. The interesting thing is that, although the Bimbo bear was born as a simple and almost intuitive symbol, it ultimately became an iconic element of Mexican popular culture. Its presence grew as the products reached more homes, were printed in advertisements, and incorporated into different publicity campaigns. Its kind appearance conveyed a message that needed no words. This bread is made with dedication. That image, which began as a drawing on paper, evolved into an emblem that later generations would recognize easily, associating it immediately with quality and tradition. At the same time, consumers were starting to become familiar with the name. They pronounced it effortlessly, associated it with the soft bread they found on the shelves, and repeated it in everyday conversations. The brand, born in a complex context and with limited resources, was beginning to occupy an emotional space in homes, a space that many other companies would take years to reach. The name and the symbol worked as two pieces of the same construction, an identity projected with clarity, capable of resonating beyond the product itself. The choice of the name and the creation of the little bear did not respond only to an exercise in aesthetics or marketing. They were part of a broader vision that sought to differentiate the company in a still conservative market. With these decisions, the founders opened the door to a new way of understanding industrial bread making, where the brand held as much weight as the recipe. In a way, they were shaping consumer culture in Mexico, introducing concepts that would define the company for decades. And while the visual identity was beginning to consolidate, the company was preparing to face one of the most complex challenges of that early stage: perfecting the daily bread until turning it into an unbreakable standard of quality. Obsession with the perfect daily bread. In the early years of Bimbo, when the company was still a bold gamble and not an industry giant, the real battle was not fought in the offices, nor in the meetings with partners, but in the silent routine of every dawn, in front of the raw dough that was still nothing, and that, with the slightest mistake, could remain halfway between what was acceptable and what was extraordinary. From very early on, it became clear that the project could not be sustained only with a good name, a nice package, and a lovable character printed on the bag. All of that would collapse under its own weight if the bread did not fulfill a very simple and at the same time tremendously demanding promise: to always be in perfect condition, day after day, without excuses and without rest. Lorenzo carried in his memory the years of El Molino, with the smell of firewood and the heat of the oven accompanying the decisions of his family. But now the scale was different. It was no longer about supplying a neighborhood, but about producing a bread that could reach an entire city, that could multiply into exact slices, that could be part of the breakfast of thousands of families, and that could maintain the same flavor, the same texture, and the same appearance in every package. That idea of consistency became a sort of silent obsession that infused the internal conversations, the instructions to the workers, and the technical decisions about machinery, ingredients, and processes. The company began to treat the recipe as if it were a kind of sacred contract with the consumer. It was not enough for the bread to be fluffy once in a while. It had to be fluffy always. That mindset required studying every detail: the type and the quality of the flour, the behavior of the yeasts, according to the ambient temperature, the relative humidity of the plant, the exact fermentation time, the duration of the baking, and the way of cooling it so that it could withstand the packaging without deforming. Nothing was left to chance, and every small variation was analyzed as if it were a major problem, because deep down it was. A slice that was outside the standard could ruin the entire experience of a family. During that stage, Bimbo developed what, without knowing it, would become one of its greatest strengths: the process mentality. For many, making bread was an imprecise, almost instinctive art. For them, it had to be a repeatable science. Instead of trusting blindly in the experience of a single master baker, they began to document, measure, and standardize. They took notes on temperatures, compared results between different batches, adjusted times depending on the season of the year, and corrected procedures when something did not turn out as expected. The workers were not simple mechanical operators, but permanent guardians of a chain of steps that had to function like a clock. That pursuit of perfection was especially noticeable in something that to the consumer could seem trivial: the slice. Ensuring that all of them had the same thickness, that the crumb remained firm but soft, that the crust was neither burnt nor pale, and that the bread could withstand transportation without breaking were indispensable requirements. The bread had to be consistent enough to make a sandwich, but at the same time so soft that a child could bite it effortlessly. That duality required a precision that many underestimated. However, inside the plant, every imperfect slice was a sort of reminder that the obsession with detail could not be relaxed. Hygiene became another cornerstone of this philosophy. In times when the same sanitation standards that we know today did not exist, Bimbo decided to get ahead and rigorously protect the production environment. Clean facilities, impeccable uniforms, permanent controls, and an internal culture that encouraged seeing cleanliness not as an imposed requirement, but as an intrinsic part of respect for the consumer. The bread had to convey trust from the first glance to the last bite, and to achieve that, a good taste was not enough. It was necessary to ensure that the entire journey from kneading to packaging was carried out under irreproachable conditions. Internally, that obsession translated into many conversations that always revolved around the same question: how to make better bread. There was no complacency, even though sales were beginning to respond favorably, and the market was signaling that the product was liked. Instead of relaxing, the management team intensified the reviews. They discussed improvements in the mixture of ingredients, evaluated new machines to cut with greater precision, inspected the ovens to avoid heat variations in different areas, and worked on methods to maintain freshness for longer without sacrificing sensory quality. The objective was simple to state and very difficult to achieve: that the bread behaved in a predictable and excellent way, regardless of the time of day or the store where it was bought. Over time, this culture of detail began to permeate beyond production and reach the entire organization. Punctuality in schedules, discipline in the use of resources, care for the equipment, and the way of recording information became infused with the same logic. It was not about doing things in any manner, but about building a way of working that would allow growth without the quality deteriorating. The company was beginning to discover that its true strength was not only in the product, but in the system they were creating to support it. The consumer, perhaps without being fully aware of what was happening behind each bag, did perceive the final result. The bread was soft, uniform, and reliable. Families could plan breakfast, a light lunch, or dinner, knowing that the product would always behave the same way. That trust, day by day, turned into loyalty. In a market where many bakeries could fail from one week to the next, consistency was an enormously differentiating value, and Bimbo was positioning itself as the brand that literally did not fail at the table. What had started as a personal obsession of those who came from a bakery tradition was transformed into a way of understanding the business. The perfect daily bread was no longer a romantic aspiration, but the core of its competitive strategy. The company understood that any future expansion, any new product, or any growth movement had to be supported by that pillar. If the bread failed, everything else would crumble. If the bread remained impeccable, the brand would have space to enter new homes, and later on, new categories. This stage of internal refinement deeply marked the character of Bimbo. Every worker knew that they were not producing a generic article, but the result of a very clear promise to millions of people who expected to open a package and find exactly what they had in mind. Working with that awareness gave meaning to the early mornings, to the tests, to the adjustments, and to the demands they made of one another in order not to lower the standard. And while the company was consolidating that culture around the perfect bread, a new strategic question emerged that went beyond the oven and the plant: how to ensure that this product, cared for in every detail, could arrive on time, in good condition, and consistently at every store in the city, and, with time, in every corner of the country. Routes, trucks, and conquering the city. When the bread began to come out of the oven perfectly, with the regularity that the founders demanded, another challenge appeared, just as complex and far less glamorous: how to ensure that this impeccable product reached the shops every morning at the exact right moment, with its freshness intact and in the proper quantities, in a city that was growing, expanding, and waking up each day with different rhythms depending on the neighborhood. Bimbo understood very early on that producing quality bread was only half of the journey. The other half consisted of building a distribution machine as precise as the production itself, a silent choreography that began long before the first customers peeked over the counter of the corner shop. The scene repeated itself over and over. Still before dawn, when the city was half asleep, the first Bimbo trucks started their engines at the plant, loaded with racks full of freshly baked bread, while the delivery drivers checked lists, routes, and schedules with an almost military focus. Those white vehicles, simple yet eye-catching, would eventually become a sort of moving symbol of the brand. But in those early years they were, above all, the founders' most ambitious bet: to personally control the distribution chain instead of depending on intermediaries who did not share the same obsession for freshness and service. Designing the routes was an exercise in strategy and patience. It was necessary to understand how the city breathed, which neighborhoods had the most activity, which shops served early rising customers, where it was worth arriving first, and which roads allowed time and fuel optimization in an era without geolocation systems or logistical software. Maps were drawn by hand, blocks were counted, travel times were calculated, and everything was adjusted again and again based on the experience each delivery driver accumulated day after day. In the end, that knowledge of the terrain turned the drivers and their assistants into key pieces of the company, because they were the ones who interpreted the real pulse of the city. The figure of the delivery driver began to take on a special prominence. He was no longer just a driver who delivered boxes, but the visible face of the brand for the neighborhood shopkeeper, the owner of the small convenience store, the attendant of the little shop inside the market. His punctuality, his demeanor, his ability to arrange the display, and his commitment to removing the previous day's product defined the shopkeeper's entire experience. Bimbo understood that, in practice, the company was being judged less by its advertisements or slogans, and more by the person who arrived every day at the door with a clean uniform, a prepared smile, and bread neatly arranged in metal racks. One of the most important decisions during that stage was the freshness policy. The bread that was not sold in one day was removed. That implied a considerable economic effort, but it sent a powerful message to shopkeepers and consumers. The bread you saw on the shelf had not been sitting around for days. It was recent, made for that cycle of consumption, intended for that day. To sustain that policy, logistics had to operate with an extremely high level of precision, calculating how much to send to each store, understanding the purchasing patterns of each area, adjusting quantities depending on the day of the week or special dates, and learning to read demand with the same rigor with which oven temperatures were monitored at the plant. As the trucks multiplied and the routes solidified, the company began to see that its true kingdom was not only inside the factory, but out on the streets. Every vehicle became a moving advertisement. Every stop was an opportunity to strengthen the relationship with a commercial partner. Every well-designed route was a competitive advantage over any bakery that depended on occasional distributors. That network of trucks, drivers, helpers, supervisors, and route managers became the backbone of a business model that, over time, would allow Bimbo to grow on a scale that surpassed the founder's original imagination. What is interesting is that, in parallel with the physical growth of that network, a very particular culture began to develop within the distribution area. The delivery drivers learned to see the city with the eyes of a strategist. They knew which shops depended most on packaged bread, understood which neighborhoods had more family-oriented customers, detected which businesses were beginning to compete with similar products, and observed changes in buying habits as new generations arrived. That information, which did not appear in any formal report in the early years but which was shared in internal conversations, helped the company make decisions about schedules, volumes, and even future openings of distribution centers. In dealing with shopkeepers, an intangible asset of enormous value was built: trust. The fact that Bimbo assumed the removal of unsold bread, cared for the presentation of the display, and maintained a constant presence with regular visits, created a relationship in which the shopkeeper perceived the brand as an ally, not just a simple supplier. In many stores, the space dedicated to bread began to be redesigned to give greater visibility to the packaged product, and the white truck that arrived every morning reinforced the sense of order and reliability in the supply. Logistics also taught the company to think ahead. Each new route opened the door to additional opportunities. If they managed to efficiently cover a neighborhood with packaged bread, later they could use the same distribution system to introduce other products. That reasoning, which at first emerged almost as pragmatic intuition, would become the basis of a portfolio expansion strategy. First, consolidate the network, then increase the number of items that this network could move without losing efficiency. In management terms, the expansion of routes forced the company to professionalize internal processes that until then depended on the direct judgment of a few individuals. Schedules began to be standardized, clear policies for truck maintenance were defined, hierarchies were established between supervisors and delivery drivers, and performance indicators were designed to measure times, deliveries, returns, and sales levels per point of sale. Gradually, the company stopped being a bakery with good distribution and became a logistical organization that also made bread. The city, for its part, began to grow accustomed to seeing Bimbo trucks as part of its everyday landscape. Mornings in avenues, neighborhoods, and markets now had an identifiable element: a white vehicle parked in front of a shop, a delivery driver arranging packages on the shelves, a series of quick movements that, repeated day after day, gave the impression of a well-oiled machine. Without grand speeches, Bimbo was claiming urban space, building a presence that went beyond the product itself. In the minds of the founders, each new consolidated route was one more step toward a greater objective: making Bimbo bread accessible on any corner where there was a shop willing to receive it. That pursuit of total coverage gave the project a different ambition, because it was no longer just about making good bread, but about being present on as many tables as possible. The geographic expansion within the city was the perfect testing ground to prove that the factory plus coordinated logistics model could scale without losing its basic principles of quality and freshness. From this solid foundation, with a distribution network that functioned like a circulatory system for the company, an almost inevitable idea emerged. If the bread arrived every day at thousands of points of sale with punctuality, that same structure could support other product lines designed for different moments of the day, thus expanding the brand's presence in people's daily lives. From white bread to a universe of brands. When the routes were already refined and the city had learned to recognize the white trucks loaded with packaged bread, a different kind of restlessness began to appear inside Bimbo, less visible than the smoke from the oven but just as powerful. If they had managed to secure a permanent place at the breakfast table of millions of people, what other moments of the day could they serve with the same discipline, the same obsession with detail, and the same distribution capability they had already mastered? The company realized that white bread was the gateway, the product that had opened the path onto Mexican tables, although daily life offered many more occasions to accompany with something baked, something sweet, something practical that could turn any pause in the day into a business opportunity. That reasoning aligned with profound changes in Mexican society. Urbanization was rising. Workdays were getting longer. Children were spending more hours at school. And families were beginning to adopt new habits, such as a light mid-morning meal, a mid-afternoon snack, or a sweet craving before returning home. Meanwhile, small neighborhood shops, stands near schools, and small businesses were filling up with informal products, without a consolidated brand, which attempted to cover that demand without a clear protagonist. From Bimbo's perspective, that was a map full of empty spaces that could be filled with proposals designed with the same rigor as packaged bread but with a different personality. The first major step in that direction was to create a family of products that would not compete with sliced bread, but would instead occupy another place in the consumer's mind. That was how Marinella was born in the decade of 1950, a brand created for cakes, buns, and packaged pastry products that served a different emotional territory. Craving, recess, the treat saved in the lunchbox, or the companion to mid-afternoon coffee. Marinella allowed the company to play with flavors, fillings, coatings, and shapes that would be difficult to integrate under the main name without diluting it. With a sister brand, Bimbo opened a new door without putting at risk the clarity of its original identity. Behind that decision was a very refined understanding of the consumer. Packaged bread was associated with home, family breakfast, sandwiches prepared calmly. In contrast, the individual snack cake spoke of impulse, of a quick purchase at the corner store, of immediate enjoyment. The context changed, the moment changed, the conversation the brand had to have with the customer changed. For this reason, the strategy did not limit itself to launching one or two products but to building a catalog that gradually filled with its own names. Coated snack cakes, filled bars, cookies with marked personality, presentations designed for a child's hand, but that also attracted adults seeking something practical to accompany their coffee. While Marinella grew, Bimbo reinforced its presence in the bread segment by exploring variations that responded to other habits. Dinner rolls, hot dog buns, hamburger buns, and different presentations of savory baked goods emerged as the answer to a recurring question inside the company: how to accompany the new ways of eating that were being introduced in Mexico, influenced by international trends, without losing control over quality and process. The brand understood that bread could stop being only a base for beans or for a traditional sandwich, and become the foundation of fast meals that adapted to a more urban lifestyle. Each new product required a careful exercise in engineering and commercial strategy. In terms of production, they had to adjust lines, design molds, decide on different baking times, work with new recipes, and above all ensure that this diversity did not affect the consistency of the classic bread. In the commercial area, it was necessary to decide which products would travel together in the trucks, how they would be organized on the displays, what space they would request from shopkeepers, and how each new item would be communicated to avoid confusing the consumer. It was not simply doing more things but expanding the portfolio with an order that allowed scaling without falling into chaos. The silent force behind this expansion was the distribution network that already operated like clockwork. Each new line took advantage of established routes, relationships built with shopkeepers, and a refined knowledge of buying behavior in different areas of the city and later the country. This logistical advantage made feasible what for other competitors would have been an enormous risk: launching several categories at the same time and bringing them to the point of sale with the same daily discipline. While other companies faced the dilemma of choosing between bread or pastry, Bimbo and its sister brands could be on both parts of the shelf, present at breakfast, during school recess, and at the afternoon snack. Brand image also became more sophisticated with this leap. Bimbo continued to appear at the table as a symbol of quality bread. Marinella spoke up when it came to sweet indulgence, and other brands in the group would appear to cover complementary territories. However, at the core, they all shared the same backbone: rigorous processes, freshness standards, and the support of impeccable distribution. This internal coherence allowed the consumer, even without knowing the details, to perceive a clear idea. If it came from the Bimbo group, the product was reliable. Internally, diversification forced the company to understand itself in a new way. It was no longer enough to be an industrial bakery. It was beginning to become a house of brands, a group capable of creating differentiated identities under a single operational philosophy. This meant recognizing that each brand needed its own language, a tone in advertising, a specific presence at the point of sale, and in many cases a different relationship with the consumer. It was much more than changing recipes. It was learning to think as several coordinated businesses. Over time, the decision to expand into new categories proved successful. Revenues diversified, dependence on packaged bread decreased, new market segments opened, and the company gained greater resilience in the face of changes in consumption habits or in the economic environment. When one category faced difficulties, another could compensate, and the group continued advancing with the security that only a well-designed portfolio structure can provide. Meanwhile, from the perspective of the entrepreneur who sees this story decades later, a key lesson is repeated in every movement. Before expanding outward, Bimbo built a solid foundation inward. Perfect bread, impeccable logistics, and the relationship with the point of sale allowed that. When the time came to multiply products and brands, the system was already prepared to support the additional weight. Diversification was not an impulsive leap, but the logical consequence of having mastered a very clear core of the business first. And once the company managed to operate with several brands, categories, and consumption moments under the same structure, an inevitable need emerged to organize itself at another level, to professionalize decisions, to build an organization capable of governing that growing universe without losing the spirit of the family bakery from which everything had begun. Professionalize the family dream. With the passing of the years, that company which had been born with a handful of partners, a well-tuned oven and a few trucks driving around the city began to grow too large to continue being managed only with intuition, memory, and informal conversations held in an improvised office inside the plant. The routes multiplied, the product categories expanded, the work centers opened in different regions of the country, and, little by little, Bimbo stopped being a great bakery to become something much more complex, an organization that needed clear rules, stable processes, and decision-making structures capable of supporting the size the business was reaching. Lorenzo, who had spent years waking up at 4 a.m. to check doughs and ovens, noticed that transformation from a privileged place. He saw how decisions no longer affected only a small group of collaborators, but thousands of families who depended on a punctual salary. Suppliers who organized their production according to its orders, and clients who expected the brand to respond consistently, even when the context changed. That weight forced him to change his own way of working. He had to begin moving from doing it himself to making others do it well, which is one of the most difficult transitions for any founder who has been on the line since the very first day. Professionalization began gradually, as great changes that endure through time usually do. First came more prepared accountants, then industrial engineers capable of mapping processes, later administrators with experience in other companies, who brought new methodologies to plan, measure, and correct. Each new incorporation implied a small cultural clash. Those newcomers spoke of budgets, indicators, organizational charts, performance evaluation, while many veterans kept trusting experience, a word given, and the direct style that characterized the life of a family business. Bimbo had to learn to combine those two worlds, avoiding excessive rigidity, but also dangerous improvisation. One of the decisive steps was turning into a system what until then had been pure habit. The way of baking, of distributing, of relating to the shopkeeper, of handling returns, of caring for plant safety. Everything began to be recorded, documented, and organized into manuals, policies, and procedures. Instead of each area functioning as an island where things are done this way because they have always been done this way, a common language was built that allowed the model to be replicated in different locations. That was key when the moment arrived to open new plants in other cities. It was no longer about sending someone to replicate the style of the main plant, but about installing a complete, tested, and well-described system. Parallel to that operational systematization, the The founders understood that something deeper needed to be put into words. What culture they wanted to preserve even as the company grew. From very early on, there was clear talk about values, about ways of relating to personnel, about the importance of dignified treatment, and about social responsibility in a country where formal employment was, for many families, the frontier between stability and uncertainty. That concern translated into internal support policies, into a real interest in people's development, and into the construction of an identity in which the worker was not seen only as a resource, but as a partner in the task of bringing bread to millions of homes. The figure of the Cervici family also transformed with this professionalization. Lorenzo went from being the man who checked mold after mold to taking on a more strategic role, focused on thinking about the long-term business, representing the company before institutions, driving expansion and ensuring that the big decisions never betrayed the principles that had defined the early years. Roberto and other members of the new generation began taking relevant positions, providing a renewed perspective, but at the same time space was opened for executives who did not carry the family surname and who demonstrated their value through results, discipline, and alignment with the culture. That balance between family legacy and external talent is one of the most delicate points in any growing company. Too much concentration in the family can close doors to valuable professionals. Too much dependence on external experts can dilute the essence that made the project special. In the case of Bimbo, the key was understanding that the family contributed an ethical code, a story, and a sense of mission, while the new executives brought techniques, methodologies, and knowledge useful for navigating an increasingly competitive business environment. Thus, instead of clashing, both worlds found a way to complement each other. In this stage, the first major formal structures also appeared. More active boards of directors, committees to review investments, medium and long-term planning systems, annual budgets discussed in detail, and a more sophisticated way of reading business information. Bread stopped being only a product that came out well or poorly from the oven to become numbers, trends, demand graphs, profitability analysis by line and by region. That quantitative lens, far from extinguishing the passion for the craft, allowed more intelligent decisions, which plants to expand, which routes to redesign, which products to promote, and which to adjust or withdraw. At the same time, the company discovered that the more it grew, the more it needed to invest in training its own people. Training programs began, internal leadership schools, technical workshops for operators and supervisors, development spaces for middle managers, who were often people who had started by carrying crates or working on the production line. That internal ladder, where an employee could imagine rising through effort and performance, strengthened commitment. Many of the leaders who would take Bimbo to expand throughout Mexico and later around the world were formed in that culture, learning to combine the pride of origin with modern management tools. Professionalization also served to overcome difficult moments. Every expansion brings risks, heavy investments, indebtedness, operational adjustments, changes in relationships with suppliers. There were years of tension, of tight margins, of difficult decisions about what to prioritize. In those periods, having systems, data, and prepared teams made the difference. Instead of depending only on the instinct of a small group, the company could rely on a more mature organization that analyzed scenarios, reviewed alternatives, and understood that sometimes growing means knowing when to say no to certain opportunities in order to protect overall stability. From the perspective of entrepreneurship, there is a powerful lesson in this stage. The same drive that helps create a company can become an obstacle if it is not accompanied by structures that allow the project to function without the founder being present in every decision. Bimbo managed to make that leap, and it did so without losing its human tone, without sacrificing respect for daily work or the closeness with the people who lifted the company from dawn in the plants and on the routes. With the family dream already transformed into a robust organization, with clear processes, with trained leaders, and with a culture capable of supporting growth, the company was ready to take the next logical step, to take that perfectly oiled machinery beyond its city of origin and consolidate itself in every corner of Mexico as a natural part of the everyday landscape. Dominating Mexico. Before crossing borders, when the internal organization began to carry its own weight, when manuals, routes, and processes allowed the company to operate with a level of synchrony that would have been unthinkable in the days of the small workshop, the time came to look beyond the Valley of Mexico, and ask a strategic question that went beyond enthusiasm. If Bimbo was already a solid brand in the capital, with a proven distribution system and an established culture, how could it become an everyday presence throughout the country? A name as familiar in the north as in the center, as close on the coast as on the high plateau. The answer did not lie in a single spectacular move, but in a chain of decisions that required patience, constant investment, and a long-term vision that was unusual for the time. Every new city Bimbo entered required complete thinking. A plant, routes, local teams, relationships with flour suppliers, and, above all, adaptation to specific customs. Mexico is not a homogeneous country, much less when it comes to bread. Each region has its own way of consuming it, its schedules, its favorite pieces, its ways of combining it with everyday meals. What worked in the capital could not be applied automatically in Monterrey, Guadalajara, Mérida, or Tijuana without fine adjustments. The company began opening regional plants under the same logic with which it had organized its first large factory. Standardized processes, an obsession with quality, and a strong commitment to direct distribution. But now it had to combine that structure with a careful reading of each market. In the north, for example, sliced bread coexisted with deep-rooted wheat flour traditions. In the west, the presence of artisanal sweet bread remained very strong. In the south, temperature and humidity put the product's freshness to the test and forced the company to rethink transport times and storage conditions. Each region was a laboratory that demanded quick learning and humble corrections. In parallel, the country was undergoing a modernization process that, although uneven, was beginning to transform daily life. Television was spreading, cities were growing, highways were connecting states that had once seemed distant, and large retail chains were starting to gain relevance alongside traditional corner shops. Bimbo understood this change and decided to be present in every possible corner of the system. From the improvised shelf in a neighborhood store to the well-lit aisle of an expanding supermarket. That transversal presence allowed the brand to become a meeting point between different social realities. In the field of communication, the company built an identity that went beyond the packaging. Radio and television commercials incorporated catchy jingles, family scenes where bread appeared as a natural part of the table, and messages that spoke of affection, togetherness, and everyday life. Millions of children grew up with those melodies lodged in their memory, associating sliced bread, rolls, and snack cakes with moments of warmth and complicity. The strategy did not seek a grandiose discourse, but an emotional closeness, almost domestic. Bimbo slipped into morning conversations, into school recesses, into lunchboxes prepared in a hurry, into improvised dinners in front of the television. Inside the plants and offices, it was understood that national consolidation required more than good commercials and efficient distribution. The company had to earn the trust of every community where it set up operations. That meant creating formal jobs, respecting local regulations, working with regional suppliers, and taking part, in one way or another, in the social life of each area. The company began to appear in community initiatives, educational support programs, internal well-being schemes for its employees, and responsible practices that, over the years, would become a distinctive hallmark. Being a major company in Mexico meant, for them, accepting that reputation is not built only at the point of sale, but in the way you behave every day with all those who form part of the chain. As plants multiplied, logistics became more sophisticated. It was no longer just about routes within a city, but about complete networks connecting states, moving inputs between regions, and balancing production when one plant reached its limit or when demand grew unexpectedly due to changes in the economy, in habits, or even in weather conditions. The entire country became a board on which the company had to decide where to invest, which areas to reinforce, which product lines to expand, and how to ensure that bread arrived with the same freshness to a neighborhood in the capital as to a provincial town. Bimbo's omnipresence began to be felt in very concrete scenes. A child in Veracruz having the same bread for breakfast as a child in Chihuahua. A factory worker in Puebla eating a sandwich during his break with the same product as an office worker in Torreón. A family in Oaxaca buying snack cakes from the same brand as a family in Baja California. That unification of consumption, without erasing the diversity of local cuisine, turned the company into an invisible thread connecting different realities. Bread became a shared language, a common element that crossed social classes, ages, and regions. From the executive's point of view, Every city conquered brought with it a new lesson. There were markets that responded better to certain products, regions where pastries sold more strongly than sliced bread, territories where school snack cakes became a key engine of growth. Those patterns began to be collected, analyzed, and turned into inputs for future decisions. The company was no longer guided only by intuition. It read data, compared behaviors, and refined its offering through a combination of local sensitivity and national vision. The fact that Bimbo managed to dominate Mexican territory before seriously considering international expansion gave it an extremely solid foundation. The group learned to operate in different environments, to deal with uneven infrastructure, to solve supply problems in remote areas, and to build long-term relationships with retailers of all sizes. When a company manages to function steadily in a country as diverse and challenging as Mexico, it acquires a kind of intensive training that later allows it to look at other markets with a mix of respect and confidence. For those who view this story from an entrepreneurial angle, there is an essential point here. Before dreaming about the world, Bimbo made sure it deeply understood its home. It strengthened its presence, understood the internal differences of its own country, built a brand that meant something concrete in people's lives, and proved that its model could be replicated in different geographies within the same territory. That work, which sometimes seems less spectacular than a press release announcing global expansion, was the true launch platform that allowed the company to take the next step without improvisation. Once Mexico was covered by a dense network of plants, routes, displays, and ingrained habits, with a product portfolio that occupied key moments of the day and an organizational culture capable of sustaining that complexity, the question stopped being whether they could grow further within the country and began to shift in another direction. What would happen if that machinery, fine-tuned over decades, dared to cross borders and put itself to the test in other markets, with different tastes, different rules, and different competitors? First leap. Bimbo leaves Mexico. When Bimbo had finished weaving its network throughout practically the entire Mexican territory, when the brand was already part of everyday vocabulary, and bread had become another ingredient of the country's domestic identity, the conversation in the headquarters began to change in tone. It no longer revolved only around new product lines or the opening of another plant in some state, but around a broader restlessness that floated in the air. What to do with such a finely tuned machine when the internal market began to show signs of maturity and the company had the capacity, the knowledge, and the ambition to look beyond its borders? The decade of the 1980s brought with it a complex scenario. Latin America experienced recurrent economic crises, devaluations, abrupt political changes, and a permanent sense of volatility. At the same time, cities grew. Middle classes sought more practical products and distribution chains began to become more sophisticated in several countries of the region. On the maps that hung on the walls of the boardrooms, Bimbo's executives saw something very clear. Nearby cultures, eating habits where bread had its place, shared languages, and a geography that, although challenging, made it possible to imagine step-by-step expansion routes, starting with the closest countries. The first major leap outside Mexico was toward Guatemala, and that decision summarized very well the blend of prudence and boldness that characterized the company at this stage. It was not about throwing themselves all at once into the largest market in the world, but about learning to be an international player in an environment relatively close in cultural and geographical terms, but different in key variables: market size, purchasing power, regulations, infrastructure, and political dynamics. In that context, the question was not only how to sell bread in another country, but how to responsibly reproduce a model that worked in Mexico within a different economic and social reality. Setting up in Guatemala meant starting many things again from zero. It was necessary to understand the structure of local commerce, to know the weight that traditional markets had compared to the supermarkets that were beginning to grow, to identify consumption habits of bread and pastry products, and, something fundamental, to achieve that a foreign brand be perceived as an ally and not as an invader arriving to displace local producers. Bimbo had to learn to listen, to work with Guatemalan talent, to adapt its portfolio, and to respect the identity of the country while introducing its quality standards, its processes, and its particular way of relating to customers. The plant, the production lines, and the distribution network were built using the experience accumulated in Mexico, but with adjustments that responded to the new challenges. The roads were not the same. Travel times varied. Temperature and humidity played differently in the preservation of the product. The currency had a different stability, and the fiscal rules required planning each investment with care. The bread came out of the oven with the same level of demand, but the terrain on which the trucks moved required a new mental map. That stage was, in many ways, an accelerated school of internationalization. At the center of everything remained the same philosophy that had guided growth in Mexico: earning the trust of shopkeepers, building long-term relationships, investing in local personnel, and being consistent between what was promised and what was delivered every day. The Guatemalan delivery workers, wearing the brand's uniforms, began to travel the streets of Guatemala City and other important towns, replicating with their presence the same scene that years before had transformed Bimbo's relationship with Mexican merchants. The difference was that now the company was learning to move with humility in a country where it was the newcomer. The expansion into Central America did not remain in a single country. Little by little, Bimbo extended its presence to other nations in the region, evaluating markets, analyzing risks, and deciding where to install its own plants, where to form partnerships, and how to structure operations capable of surviving economic fluctuations that, in those years, were part of Latin American normality. Each new country added variables: fragile banking systems, exchange rate instability, sudden changes in import policies, cultural differences that affected the consumption of bread and pastries. However, each challenge overcome reinforced a conviction: the model they had created was exportable, as long as there was patience and sensitivity to adapt it. Internally, internationalization forced the company to mature at a different speed. It was not enough to be very good in Mexico. It was necessary to build teams capable of thinking in regional terms, managing exchange rate risks, designing fiscal strategies, coordinating logistics among countries, protecting reputation in contexts where information flowed faster every day and where a poorly considered decision could have an impact beyond borders. At the management level, profiles with international experience began to appear. Areas focused on integrating operations outside Mexico were created, and the governance of the group was strengthened to prevent each country from becoming a kind of isolated kingdom. The corporate culture had to take an additional step. Bimbo had defined itself for decades from a very marked Mexican identity, from a family history deeply tied to the country. By going out, it had to learn to be a multinational company without losing that root. That meant, for example, keeping intact its ethical principles, its way of treating its people, and its obsession with quality, while at the same time making space for new ways of working, for management styles specific to each region, and for local expressions of the brand. What worked in a television advertisement in Mexico did not transfer automatically to a commercial in Central America. The campaigns had to respect the sensitivity, values, and humor of each society. Over the years, expansion through Latin America drew an increasingly broad map. Countries such as Chile, Argentina, Colombia, or Peru were added to the list of markets where the group operated with its own brands, with acquisitions of local companies or with combinations of both strategies. Sometimes the chosen path was to buy a bakery company that already had prestige and distribution networks, and then strengthen it with technology, capital, and operational knowledge. In other cases, they opted to grow from zero, installing new plants and building the brand step by step. Those decisions reflect immense strategic flexibility, always guided by a common criterion: wherever they entered, they did so to stay. In daily life, Bimbo's presence in these countries began to resemble what had happened years earlier in Mexico. The trucks circulated through the cities, the bread rolls and pastries appeared in school recesses, lunchboxes were filled with products from the group, the advertisements became part of the background noise of daily life. However, behind that apparent repetition, there was a crucial difference. The group was learning to be many things at once, to coexist with different economic rhythms, with varied regulatory frameworks, and with cultures that adopted the brand in their own way. For the founders who were still involved and for the directors of the new generation, seeing the company's logo cross borders was a symbolic confirmation of something that, for a long time, had been only a dream worked on in silence. A Mexican family bakery was transforming into a regional player that competed in different countries, with solid structures and with a portfolio of brands that was beginning to dialogue with very diverse realities. That achievement, however, did not come with excessive euphoria, but with a very clear awareness that each step outward brought greater responsibilities. Because, as Bimbo consolidated itself in Latin America, the global board changed. Trade liberalization advanced. International treaties reconfigured the rules of the game, and the large food groups of the world began to look at the region with renewed interest. In that context, the company had to decide whether it was satisfied with being a regional power, or whether it dared to compete in the most competitive markets on the planet, those where industrial baking was a daily war of centenary brands, gigantic supermarket chains, and consumers accustomed to a very wide offering. With that question becoming increasingly present in strategic discussions, the group's attention began to turn northward, toward a market where industrial bread had colossal dimensions, and where any misstep could be very costly. But where, at the same time, a well-executed move could change forever the scale and destiny of the company. Conquering the United States through sheer purchasing power. By the end of the 1990s, Bimbo had demonstrated that its model could be replicated in diverse markets, some with fragile economic conditions, others with intense local competition, and several with infrastructures that demanded constant creativity to sustain quality and distribution. However, when looking at the full map, there was a territory that stood out above all others: the United States. It not only represented the largest industrial bread market in the world, but also a setting where consumer dynamics, logistical scale, and the presence of historic brands made it the ultimate test for any company aspiring to become global. The move toward that country could not be made with improvisations. It required a surgical strategy, a deep understanding of the competition, and, above all, an absolute conviction that entering merely to try their luck would be a fatal error. In internal conversations, one clear idea was repeated: competing from zero against brands that had dominated store shelves for decades was not realistic. The purchasing habits of the United States consumer were deeply rooted, and distribution responded to rules different from those of Latin America. The project needed a legitimate shortcut, a way to enter the market without going through a slow period of reputation building. That shortcut was the acquisition of local companies that already had presence, infrastructure, and recognition. Bimbo had to become the shadow behind names that the consumer already loved, maintaining the quality that characterized it, but without expecting the Mexican brand to conquer the public's mind immediately. The first major move arrived in the year 2001, when Bimbo acquired the operation of George Weston on the west coast of the United States. With that purchase, which represented a considerable financial bet, the Mexican group obtained direct access to brands such as Oro Wheat, Thomas's, Brownberry, and Arnold, all of them deeply rooted in the pantries of the United States. It was a perfect strategic blow. Instead of entering as an unknown player, the company entered the market through names with decades of earned trust, now backed by its operational experience and its obsession with quality. This acquisition did not only mean plants, trucks, and employees. It was a doorway into the complex bread-making culture of the United States. There, bread has more varieties, more styles, more regional differences, and a fierce level of competition. The consumer is accustomed to finding options for every preference: multigrain breads, whole grain breads, artisanal breads, round breads, lightly sweet breads, extremely fibrous breads, or breads made with special yeasts. Understanding that ecosystem required humility. Bimbo could not arrive to dictate rules. It had to integrate into an industry that already had its own codes and adapt its knowledge to elevate operations without altering the essence of the acquired brands. Operational integration was a monumental task. The plants of the United States worked with systems very different from those Bimbo had in Mexico or Latin America. Food safety regulations were more demanding. Labor relations functioned under different laws. Operating costs were higher, and negotiations with supermarket chains required an even finer level of professionalization. However, the company quickly understood that this was the kind of challenge that only firms with truly solid structures could face. It had to absorb the complexity without losing its identity, injecting Mexican efficiency into a United States tradition without generating unnecessary friction. The most transformative impact of this process occurred within the internal culture of the group. Suddenly, Bimbo found itself managing thousands of employees in a country with a completely different social dynamic. with strong unions, with consumers who were very vocal, and with competition that left no open spaces. It was essential to strengthen training in leadership, intercultural management, data-driven decision-making, and strategic communication. Executives who traveled to the United States returned with a mixture of enthusiasm and respect. They had seen the size of the opportunity, but also the magnitude of the challenge. For the company, it was clear that this first acquisition had to be the beginning and not the end. The United States market was divided into regions dominated by different players, and to truly compete it was necessary to build a national presence. Therefore, the following years were marked by a series of calculated moves focused on reinforcing coverage. Meanwhile, Bimbo learned to build relationships with the country's major retail chains, from historic supermarkets to convenience stores and wholesalers that demanded absolute punctuality, transparency in pricing, and a level of service with no margin for error. With every step, the company reaffirmed that its expansion strategy had to continue through acquisitions. The logic was clear: acquiring companies with a solid history, improving their operations, integrating their logistical systems, and turning them into part of a larger ecosystem where every piece contributed something. Regional presence, technical expertise, well-positioned brands, or distribution infrastructure difficult to replicate from zero. Entry into the United States also forced the company to think about the business from a more global perspective. The competition was no longer limited to regional or national firms, but included multinational giants operating with much larger budgets, advanced innovation pipelines, and global relationships with suppliers and institutions. To remain in that environment, Bimbo had to accelerate its internal modernization, adopting more sophisticated technologies, digitalizing processes, strengthening production traceability, and professionalizing areas such as strategic planning, risk management, and advanced information analysis. The bet was enormous, but the potential was even greater. If they managed to consolidate themselves in the United States, the entire scale of the group would change forever. The company would become not only a Latin American player with international presence, but a global giant capable of competing in the most demanding arena on the planet. That idea generated a mixture of vertigo and enthusiasm among decision-makers. Every purchase, every negotiation, every integration was a step toward a transformation that had no way back. For the founders who still observed the growth of the group, entering the United States held immense symbolic value. That project, born in a small family bakery, wrapped in the smell of an artisanal oven, was now competing in the first division of industrial bread-making. Humility remained a central value, but now accompanied by confidence in the internal capabilities that had been earned through decades of meticulous expansion. As operations stabilized in the neighboring country, the group understood that there was still a decisive move left to completely change its scale and consolidate its presence in the most competitive market in the world. That move would arrive shortly after, with an acquisition so large that it would completely redefine the size and identity of Bimbo on the global stage. The giant move. The purchase of Sara Lee. When Bimbo was already established in the United States, when it had learned to navigate historical brands, strong unions, and supermarket chains that negotiated every inch of shelf space, an opportunity appeared unlike any of the previous ones. One of those moments that divide the history of a company into a before and an after. The Mexican baking company, which was already operating relevant brands in different regions of the country, found itself facing the possibility of purchasing the fresh bread business of Sara Lee in North America, a giant that had spent decades baking for millions of American families and that held a deep place in the memory of consumers. The magnitude of the move commanded respect from the first number. The operation hovered around $959 million, a figure that required examining every variable with cold precision. Expected profitability, real synergies, integration risks, competitors' reactions, internal capacity to absorb an acquisition of that size, and above all, the question any responsible executive had to ask quietly: whether the group was prepared to digest such a large bite without endangering what it had built over decades. This was not just another expansion. It was a scale jump that could catapult the company to the global front line or turn into an unmanageable burden if things went wrong. Sara Lee's fresh bread business was far more than a brand on the packaging. Behind it was a network of plants spread throughout the United States. Thousands of employees, complex contracts with retail chains, a product portfolio that ranged from sliced bread to pastries and tortillas, established processes, local cultures within each plant, and a particular way of connecting with consumers. Incorporating all of that meant adding industrial muscle, geographic presence, and recognized brands, but also implied stepping into a delicate operating room. Changing without breaking, integrating without humiliating, improving without altering what the customer already appreciated. In high-level meetings, maps of the United States filled with points, lines, and circles. Each Sara Lee plant was analyzed as a piece of a puzzle that had to fit with the facilities that Bimbo already had in operation. Distances were studied, coverage zones, installed capacity, the possibility of closing some lines to concentrate production elsewhere, potential savings in distribution routes, and, crucially, the way to consolidate a network that covered practically the entire territory without generating costly duplications. This was a large-scale chess game. Each plant closed or reconfigured meant savings, but also social impact, labor adjustments, personnel realignments, and complex negotiations. The human side of the integration was perhaps the most delicate. Thousands of workers who for years had regarded Sara Lee as their reference suddenly woke up one day as part of a Mexican group whose name many had never heard. There was curiosity, suspicion, fear, and hope mixed together. Bimbo's leadership knew that if they wanted the operation to work, they had to enter with respect, listen to local teams, understand their concerns, consider cultural differences, and communicate clearly what was expected, what would remain, and what would change. Visits from Mexican executives to plants in the United States became frequent, with walkthroughs of production lines, meetings with middle management, and encounters with employees, in which the company's history helped explain that they were joining a group that knew the craft, that came from the oven, not just from financial offices. Meanwhile, technical teams worked tirelessly to harmonize processes. They had to review recipes, baking parameters, safety standards, maintenance systems, planning software, inventory control tools, and quality methodologies. Some Sara Lee practices turned out to be superior in certain aspects and were adopted by Bimbo. Others were aligned with the models the group had already tested in other countries. Far from automatically imposing its own way of working, the company approached the integration as a two-way learning process. Entering the United States through an acquisition of that scale was also an opportunity to raise the level of the entire organization. From the consumer's perspective, the most interesting thing was that, for a time, many families continued buying the same brands as always, without knowing that behind the Sara Lee logo or other sub-brands, the owner had changed. The bread remained on the shelf, the ads continued airing on radio and television, the promotions kept appearing in supermarket aisles, and while all that happened, a monumental change in ownership and management was unfolding in office desks and boardrooms. That is a powerful lesson of the business world. Major strategic changes, when executed well, are felt inside before they are visible outside. At the financial level, the acquisition transformed the scale of the group immediately. Bimbo began operating hundreds of additional work centers in North America, significantly increased its sales volume, and positioned itself as the largest baking company in the American market in terms of market share and installed capacity. This new dimension changed the tone of its relationship with global suppliers, with retail chains, and with other actors in the industry. It was no longer a foreign company in expansion, but a player with structural weight in the category, capable of influencing standards, trends, and long-term negotiations. However, with the increase in size came greater responsibilities. Managing an organization that now spanned dozens of countries, thousands of products, and a gigantic workforce required more robust corporate governance systems, better controls, greater transparency in information, and an executive capacity able to coordinate regions with very different realities. Bimbo had to invest heavily in technology, in platforms that allowed the business to be seen in real time, in scenario planning models, and in structures that reduced the chances of unpleasant surprises derived from complexity. Symbolically, the purchase of Sara Lee's fresh bread business in North America meant something that, decades earlier, would have sounded almost unbelievable. A company born in a family bakery in Mexico City, built through early mornings, lit ovens, and trucks driving through working-class neighborhoods, had become the owner of a significant portion of the industrial baking industry. of the country that for so long had been seen as the epicenter of modern capitalism. This investment inverted the traditional narrative in which northern multinationals bought companies in the South. Here it was a Latin American group that went shopping and acquired a very relevant slice of the northern market. From an entrepreneurial perspective, the Sara Lee move leaves several lessons. The first, that there comes a point in the growth of a company when transformative opportunities appear very few times, and when they do, one must be prepared in structure, culture, and finances to seize them without breaking the project. The second, that a gigantic acquisition is not justified only by its size, but by the logic that connects what is purchased with what is already owned. In this case, strengthening the presence in the United States, filling geographic gaps, adding brands, and leveraging logistical synergies. The third, that ambition without prudence leads to disaster, but prudence without ambition condemns one to irrelevance. When the dust of the integration began to settle, what emerged was a group unrecognizable compared to its own version of a few decades earlier. Dominant presence in Mexico, growing leadership in Latin America, a position of weight in the United States, and a network of plants, roots, and brands that placed it on the front line of global baking. And from that moment on, the question was no longer whether it could become a global giant, but transformed into an even more challenging one. How to manage that new scale, continue growing on other continents, and keep alive. Amid so much complexity, the convictions that had been born in that small family bakery that lit its oven before dawn. From regional to global bread giant, when the acquisition of the fresh bread business of Sara Lee finally settled, the operations map of Bimbo no longer resembled in any way that of the company that, decades earlier, had begun its journey lifting flour in a neighborhood bakery. The group was present in Mexico with overwhelming strength, occupied a large part of Latin America with brands that had become integrated into the daily life of millions of households, and had become an industrial powerhouse in the United States. However, the leadership understood that this growth, although impressive, did not yet represent the final frontier. There were markets in Europe, Asia, the Middle East, and Africa where the categories of industrial baking were undergoing a full transformation, where consumption habits were changing rapidly, and where large global groups competed for every point of market share. If the group wanted to consolidate itself as the largest baker on the planet, it had to make the decision that defines companies that transcend, to go out and compete in territories where no one is waiting for you. The expansion into Europe was, in that sense, a test unlike anything experienced before. Europeans have a historic relationship with bread, more ritualized, more rooted in traditional techniques, and more linked to the gastronomic identity of each country. France has its baguette as a national symbol. The industrial north of Spain lives with robust loaves. Germany is full of whole grain and rye varieties, and consumers in the United Kingdom have completely different preferences. Entering there meant accepting that the company could not impose its style, but had to integrate into cultures where bread is filled with memory and tradition, even when it comes to industrialized products. For that reason, the European strategy was executed through carefully selected acquisitions, betting on companies that already had a strong connection to their markets. The logic was the same as in the United States, but with nuances. To respect local recipes, to understand consumption rhythms, to absorb regional knowledge, and to contribute modernization in processes, logistics, and efficiency. The presence of the group in Spain, for example, opened the door to learning techniques, ingredients, and methods that would later influence operations in other regions. Instead of exporting the Latin American formula, Bimbo began to import knowledge from centuries-old bread cultures to enrich its global offering. Meanwhile, Asia represented a completely different challenge. It is a continent where bread making is not a traditional part of the diet, but where cities modernize at a speed that changes habits daily. There, packaged bread began to gain space in supermarkets, convenience stores, and coffee shops, especially in countries with emerging middle classes and accelerated lifestyles. In that scenario, the group identified an opportunity to enter early, before the markets became saturated. Japan, China, and India required a special sensitivity. Each country had its own expectations of flavor, texture, and presentation. Soft white bread could be appealing in certain regions, But in others, more sweet varieties were needed, smaller formats or combinations with local ingredients. Flexibility became a key tool, as there was no single solution that would work across the entire continent. In the Middle East and North Africa, the logic was different. There, traditional bread has a deeply cultural dimension. Flatbreads, ancient recipes passed down in family ovens, and habits that rarely adjust to industrialized products. Even so, urban growth and the arrival of modern retail opened windows that Bimbo knew how to take advantage of by entering through targeted acquisitions and strategic alliances in countries where urban centers required practical, safe and packaged products. In those markets, more than competing for volume, the company sought to learn and understand how to position specific lines in societies with very particular food customs. Every move outside the American continent forced the company to rethink its definition of globality. It was not about turning the brand into a universal symbol, but about weaving a network of operations where hundreds of products adapted to different contexts could coexist, supported by a common set of operational and ethical principles. What was global for Bimbo was not uniform bread, but the way of producing it. Industrial discipline, obsession with freshness, investment in logistics, respect for collaborators, and the long-term vision that guided every acquisition. Growth led the group to become a gigantic organization, with tens of thousands of collaborators spread across more than 70 countries, hundreds of plants, and a portfolio of brands that, in many cases, surpassed the recognition of the parent brand. This diversity required an internal structure capable of coordinating without suffocating, supervising without imposing, and integrating without losing clarity of purpose. Regional councils, innovation committees, global quality areas, and multi-local logistics teams became fundamental pieces to maintain cohesion. The company began to operate as an interconnected system, where a plant in Portugal could share learnings with another in Mexico, and where an innovation to reduce emissions in Canada could be replicated in Chile or in China. In this global stage, one of the decisive factors was the way the group treated the relationship between local brands and the global brand. In many countries, the acquired brands had deep roots. Changing their names would have been a historic mistake. Bimbo knew how to respect that identity and allowed each brand to continue speaking in its own language to its consumers, while receiving logistical, human, and technological support from the group. That sensitivity allowed the expansion not to crush local cultures, but to rely on them. International presence also forced the group to take environmental and social responsibility very seriously. Operating on a global scale means facing very different demands and regulations, safety standards, labor expectations, and sustainability requirements. To remain competitive, Bimbo began to invest rapidly in energy efficiency, waste reduction programs, cleaner logistics, less polluting packaging technologies, and practices that protected the reputation of a food company that could no longer afford mistakes. The group understood that although its expansion was impressive, permanence depended on an ethical evolution accompanying industrial growth. From a leadership perspective, managing a company that had already surpassed continental scale required a profound transformation. Executives had to learn to think in global terms, to interpret signals from very different markets, and to act without losing sight of the history that had given birth to it all. In every important decision, an ancient echo resonated. The idea that the bread had to turn out well every day, no matter where the oven was. That phrase, which had been born in a small Mexican bakery, now became a standard for plants across several continents. The global expansion, with all its complexity, ultimately confirmed something that had already been sensed since the first roots in Mexico City. The group had an extraordinary ability to integrate diverse cultures, processes, and teams without fragmenting. That organizational talent would be key to facing the next challenge, perhaps the most delicate of all: how to continue being a beloved and trustworthy company in a world where consumption was beginning to be questioned, where food industries faced criticism, and where public conversation demanded transparency, responsibility, and permanent evolution. Criticisms, crises, and redefining what it means to feed. At the beginning of the 21st century, when Bimbo was already operating as a gigantic multinational company, with plants spread across several continents and brands that coexisted daily with millions of consumers, a deep cultural shift began to emerge, one that no food company could ignore. The world had spent decades enthusiastically embracing industrialized products. But that confidence began to fracture under the scrutiny of a more informed, more skeptical, and more demanding generation. One that examined ingredients, processes, labels, and advertising messages with an intensity never seen before. In that scenario, packaged bread, pastries, and sweet-baked goods, categories in which Bimbo clearly dominated, became the target of debates, questions, and regulatory pressure. The first major blow came hand in hand with the discussion about ultra-processed foods. Researchers, nutritionists, medical specialists, and communicators began pointing out that although these products had been part of economic growth and of the mass access to safe foods, they presented risks when consumed too frequently. Sugar, fats, certain additives, and preservatives started occupying central spaces in television programs, newspaper articles, and family conversations. Suddenly, what had been seen for decades as practical and reliable began to be perceived with suspicion, and companies had to decide whether to resist the change or adapt their offerings without sacrificing their identity. In the case of Bimbo, the issue touched very deep fibers. The company had built its reputation on the idea of consistent quality and trust. However, that trust needed to be updated in a context where consumer priorities were no longer focused solely on practicality, but also on health, ingredient origin, transparency, and authenticity. Remaining silent was not an option. The group needed to move pieces and do so with determination, without falling into superficial gestures that consumers detect immediately. The first front was reformulation. Many recipes began to be reviewed carefully. Gradual reduction of sugars, adjustments in fats, elimination of artificial colorants, incorporation of cleaner ingredients, and a commitment to whole grain products that were not merely decorative variants in the portfolio. This process, far from being linear, involved internal tension. Changing a recipe affects flavor, texture, shelf life, and costs. It required research, testing, and a careful balance between nutritional responsibility and market acceptance. Even so, the company accepted the challenge, aware that the world would not return to the blind confidence of previous decades. In parallel, regulatory pressures were increasing. Governments in different countries began requiring front-facing labels, visible warnings, strict limits on advertising directed at children, and higher information standards. For a global company, this meant coexisting with different rules in each region and adapting to each environment without losing competitiveness. In Mexico, for example, the warning label system forced the redesign of packaging and the reconsideration of how to communicate value without downplaying risks. In Chile, Peru, and other Latin American countries, similar regulations emerged that fundamentally changed the way brands interacted with the public. Public conversation also became more delicate. On social media, criticisms, memes, heated debates, and comments appeared, spreading any mistake rapidly. A product with excess sugar or a controversial ingredient could generate a reputation crisis within hours. This new reality forced the group to strengthen its communication areas: digital monitoring, informational transparency, and nutritional education. It was necessary to respond with data, with clarity, and with a more dialogue-oriented attitude rather than a defensive one. Consumers no longer accepted rigid corporate speech. They wanted explanations, evidence, and concrete changes. Operationally, another challenge struck the global industry: crises in supply chains. The fluctuation in the price of wheat, oil, fuel, geopolitical tensions, climatic changes that altered harvests, and the dependence on maritime routes that could be interrupted without prior notice put Bimbo's resilience to the test. For years, the company had been working to make its logistics efficient, but the magnitude of these crises forced it to strengthen strategic warehouses, diversify suppliers, invest in predictive technology, and adjust production models to minimize the impact on prices and availability. Added to these challenges were criticisms questioning global expansion in ethical and environmental terms. Moving products at large scale implies emissions, intensive use of packaging, energy consumption, and pressure on agricultural systems. The company began to receive demands for greater ecological responsibility. Environmental groups and conscious consumers started asking insistently what a giant like Bimbo was doing to reduce its footprint. That social pressure coincided with internal commitments the group had already been working on: accelerating plans for renewable energy use, route optimization to reduce fuel, recyclable or biodegradable packaging, and programs designed to reduce waste throughout the entire chain. In the midst of this challenging environment, internal reflection at Bimbo deepened. The question was no longer only how to sell more or how to expand into new markets, but what the role of a food company should be in a world that was beginning to reconsider the way it feeds itself. What does it mean to nourish in the 21st century? How can accessibility be combined with health? In what way can a company so large positively influence food culture without falling into paternalism or ignoring local preferences? These discussions began shaping broader movements: product lines with fewer ingredients, greater protagonism of whole grains, options with reduced sugar, gluten-free versions in markets that demanded them, and communication strategies that spoke of balance rather than indulgence. The group understood that trust is built with coherence. It is not enough to modify recipes. It is also necessary to modify the message and the relationship with the consumer. Seeing this process from an entrepreneurial perspective reveals a fundamental principle. Every company that reaches great scale must learn to dialogue with the time in which it exists. What worked in the 1950s, the 1980s, or the early 2000s can no longer stand without adaptation. Greatness is not only about conquering markets, but transforming oneself without losing the soul when the world changes. The weight of being an omnipresent brand also implies an implicit duty: to assume responsibility for how you influence habits, nutritional perceptions, and everyday decisions that affect health. Bimbo, with its successes and errors, began navigating this stage with the awareness that it could not stay on the sidelines of the debate, because feeding is not only about filling a table, but about contributing value in a broader sense. And while the company responded to criticisms, regulations, and new demands, it was preparing for another chapter in its history, one that would force it to move toward a more sustainable, more technological vision, more aligned with the future that was unfolding before its eyes. Sustainability, future, and the company that learns. By the middle of the decade of 2010, when the noise surrounding public health, environmental impact, and social responsibility was beginning to occupy more space in the media, in universities, and in the daily thinking of far more conscious consumers, it became evident inside Bimbo that the discussion could no longer revolve solely around bread or roots, not even around international expansion. The world was entering a phase in which large food companies would not be evaluated only by the quality of their products, but by the footprint they left on the planet, by the way they treated their workers, by the transparency of their decisions, and by their ability to anticipate what was coming. Long-term survival depended, in part, on accepting that the scale they had achieved required moving with a perspective broader than strictly commercial logic. Until that moment, sustainability had been a recurring topic in internal conversations, but in a dispersed way, linked to specific initiatives inside plants or distribution fleets. However, social pressure and the demands of different governments began transforming that concern into a strategic obligation. The company understood that if it wanted to continue occupying a central place in the lives of millions of families, it needed to demonstrate that its growth could be compatible with environmental protection, with the creation of dignified employment, and with the transition toward less aggressive productive models. It was not about marketing, but about credibility. One of the deepest changes came through energy. The group began major investments so that a significant portion of its operations would be powered by renewable sources. The installation of wind farms in Mexico was both a symbolic and operational milestone. Not only did they supply key plants, they also sent a clear message about the direction the group intended to take. In parallel, production centers in several countries were modernized so they would consume less energy, optimize the use of residual heat, and take advantage of new baking technologies that reduced emissions without affecting product quality. Logistics, that system that had been a competitive advantage since the early years, also became a field for transformation. Trucks began incorporating more efficient engines. Routes were recalculated with advanced software to reduce unnecessary kilometers. And in markets where it was possible, pilots of electric vehicles served as the foundation for a future with less dependence on diesel. Although the transition was not simple, because distances, volumes, and the temperature required for bread complicated any innovation, the group embraced the challenge with pragmatism and ambition. In parallel, another concern emerged: packaging. Plastic bags, present since the early years of packaged bread, had been a fundamental part of the brand's history. But they became a sensitive point in the environmental debate. The company began working on recyclable materials, on thinner packaging, and on circular economy projects that sought to integrate consumers, collection points, and industrial partners into the chain. These changes required investments in technology, adjustments in plants, and educational campaigns directed at customers. But they were part of a vision that understood that the world would demand, sooner or later, more responsible solutions. Sustainability, however, was not only environmental. It also included the relationship with the thousands of collaborators who were part of the group around the world. Bimbo strengthened workplace safety programs, developed initiatives for physical and emotional well-being, promoted internal mobility, supported community programs, and reinforced ethical codes that aimed to shield corporate conduct in markets where corruption, informality, or social pressure could compromise operations. The company knew that culture had to reflect its values, and that operating in more than 70 countries required a serious commitment to integrity. Technological innovation emerged as another inevitable axis. The group began investing in automation, in artificial intelligence for demand planning, in sensors inside production lines that anticipated failures, and in platforms that allowed plants to be monitored in real time from neural centers. This modernization did not seek to replace workers, but to free the organization from repetitive tasks and allow human talent to focus on higher value activities, from food research to logistics optimization or the design of new products. In parallel, the group promoted the development of foods with a better nutritional profile. Many new lines were born under this philosophy. Breads with higher fiber content, whole grain products with revised formulas, reduced sugar lines, and options oriented towards sports or specific diets. These launches were not a simple gesture of commercial cosmetics. They responded to the understanding that the company needed to participate actively in transforming the food offering without losing its essence or falling into extreme solutions that ignored the real habits of the population. At a global level, the company realized that sustainability had become a decisive factor for maintaining alliances with governments, supermarkets, international organizations, and consumers who, in many cases, made decisions based on the environmental behavior of brands. Large retailers began to demand transparent reports, measurable commitments, and verifiable results. The group adapted to that dynamic with the same discipline with which, decades earlier, it had decided that bread had to be perfect every single day. What is notable is that while facing these challenges, Bimbo began integrating sustainability into its identity in a way that transcended technical matters. The internal message became infused with notions of legacy, of intergenerational responsibility, and of awareness of the impact a company of its scale could have on the lives of millions. Long-term vision, which had always been a central piece of organizational culture, now included a future in which the company would not only survive, but actively contribute to improving the relationship between food, health, and the environment. From an entrepreneurial perspective, this stage offers an essential lesson. When a company grows large enough that its disappearance would have significant consequences, it must accept that the world expects more from it than simply products on shelves. It must transform itself, educate itself, and be willing to reinvent itself as many times as necessary. That capacity for continuous learning was what allowed Bimbo to remain standing in moments of regulatory pressure, public scrutiny, and profound cultural change. And while those adjustments consolidated a new chapter, one more conscious, more open to change, and more aligned with the future, the company prepared to face the final dimension of its recent history: how to preserve a legacy and renew it at the same time. In an era in which food was being reconfigured, and in which consumers sought more than bread, they sought purpose, coherence, and companies that understood the time in which they lived. The next oven. The future of Bimbo. There is a moment in the history of any long-lived company when the past is no longer enough to answer the questions that are coming, and Bimbo is exactly at that point, with one foot resting on almost 80 years of experience, and the other testing a terrain that is changing at a pace very different from that of its first decades. A terrain where the digital world, health, climate, demography, and technology are rewriting the way the world eats, organizes itself, and decides whom to trust each time it extends a hand toward a shelf or clicks on a screen. The immediate future of Bimbo is being played on several layers at the same time. On one hand, there is the transformation of consumption. New generations that read labels, that inform themselves through social networks, that shop from the sofa, and that compare in seconds what their parents took years to discover. For a company built around the daily visit to the physical point of sale, this implies rethinking the way it relates to people. The delivery truck remains fundamental, but now it coexists with mobile applications, rapid delivery platforms, online stores, frequent product subscriptions, and direct channels where the group itself can speak to the consumer without intermediaries, gather opinions, test new formats, and adjust in almost real time. In that direction, bread stops being only a product waiting quietly on the shelf and becomes part of broader experiences. Weekly boxes with combinations of specialty breads, alliances with coffee shops and restaurant chains that look for ready-to-serve solutions, complete breakfast proposals that include bread, beverage, and complements, and even personalization models where the user can choose the type of bread, slicing, added ingredients, and receive everything packaged according to personal preferences. The commercial future of the group depends on understanding that 21st century convenience is not the same as that of the second half of the 20th century, and that the familiarity of the brand has to serve those new habits. Another unavoidable front lies in the very concept of the product. Trends toward cleaner foods, with short and recognizable ingredient lists, with less added sugar, higher fiber content, better fat profiles, and, in many cases, with specific certifications, organic, vegan, fair trade, made with ancestral grains, will continue to put pressure on the portfolio. For Bimbo, this means accelerating the creation of lines that speak to that demanding consumer, without losing accessibility or falling into proposals that only a few can afford. The door opens to breads made with recovered local grains, to recipes inspired by regional traditions but adapted to modern formats, to solutions for people with dietary restrictions, and to products designed for specific contexts such as sports, cognitive performance, or metabolic health. Behind all of this, a gigantic technical challenge takes shape, innovating without breaking the delicate balance between flavor, texture, price, and logistics. The company will have to continue investing in research and development, in laboratories where food technologists, nutritionists, chefs, and consumer specialists work together, testing new flours, long fermentations, cereal combinations, and processes that allow offering something different without betraying the experience of biting into a Bimbo bread and recognizing it as trustworthy. Technology will not remain only in the product. The entire chain is called to become smarter. Machine learning algorithms can help predict demand by neighborhood, by store, and even by weather, preventing overproduction and waste, optimizing routes, reducing returns, and adjusting in real time what is produced, in which plant, and where it is sent. Production lines will no longer be automated only in the mechanical sense, but connected, capable of communicating with commercial and logistic systems to make finer decisions. A failure in a specific line can be anticipated through vibration patterns, temperature, or electrical consumption, avoiding stoppages that previously cost hours of work and thousands of packages. In the environmental field, the future will require going beyond current commitments. The global debate about climate change, responsible water use, the protection of agricultural soils, and the drastic reduction of waste will push the group toward even more ambitious models, expanding the use of renewable energies until covering almost all its operations, integrating regenerative agriculture criteria with wheat and other grain suppliers, working hand in hand with farmers to improve yields without destroying ecosystems, and driving systems for capturing and reusing heat and water inside the plants. Bimbo, due to its scale, has the capacity to influence upstream in the chain, changing agricultural practices that affect entire countries. On the social side, the company will need to learn to be a relevant employer for generations that do not conceive working life as their grandparents did. Young people arriving at the plants, offices, or distribution centers seek purpose, development, flexibility, mental and physical well-being, and coherence between discourse and practice. The future of Bimbo depends on building more dynamic careers, where a collaborator can move between countries, areas, and roles, on strengthening diversity at all levels, on opening real spaces for female leadership, on incorporating different perspectives into offices historically dominated by a relatively homogeneous profile, and on becoming a talent school that forms professionals capable of directing not only ovens and roots, but social impact projects. On the leadership level, generational transition is already a reality. The founders have left or stepped away from direct management long ago, and the helm is in the hands of professional executives who grew within the organization or joined from outside, with a vision influenced by globalization, the climate agenda, and the digital revolution. The challenge for them is enormous, keeping alive the spirit of the small bakery, that obsession with well-made bread, that respect for the customer and the collaborator while making decisions that affect plants in multiple latitudes, markets with very different rhythms, and investors who examine results with a magnifying glass quarter after quarter. Something that will likely continue marking the personality of Bimbo in the coming years is its ability to move between the industrial and the close. The group can explore more artisanal product lines within an industrial framework, collaborate with local bakeries, rescue slow fermentation techniques, reinterpret traditional pieces in packaged formats, and, at the same time, continue producing millions of slices of sandwich bread every day. The combination of those two worlds, the world of scale and the world of authenticity, will be key for the brand to preserve relevance in cities where the consumer alternates between the neighborhood bakery, the delivery application, and the supermarket. From the perspective of someone observing this entire story, it becomes inevitable to return to the initial image. An oven lit at dawn, an immigrant family counting coins, a child silently watching how bread holds the fate of the day. The future of Bimbo, no matter how sophisticated it may seem when speaking of artificial intelligence, renewable energies, or global expansion, still depends on the same basic promise they made in that modest shop in Mexico City, that whatever comes out of the oven, wherever that oven is, must be worthy of the trust that millions of people place in every slice. And while the world changes its diet, its channels, its priorities, and its language, the company will continue waking up at dawn, adjusting ovens, fine-tuning routes, and rethinking its products, because at its core its story is not that of an abstract multinational, but that of a project that starts anew every day from the same place. The exact moment when the raw dough enters the heat and decides whether it will become, once again, the bread with which a family will begin its morning. Thank you for accompanying me to the end of this journey through the history of Bimbo, one of the most fascinating companies in the Spanish-speaking world. I would love to read in the comments which part surprised you the most and which company you would like us to analyze next. If you enjoy this style of documentaries and want to support the project, subscribe and activate the bell so you do not miss the next episodes. Good night.